The oil shock that should worry Europe most is not the one people can see at the gas station. That is only the surface. The real shock is quieter. It sits in the refinery system. It sits in jet fuel contracts. It sits in diesel imports. It sits in airline schedules for the summer season. It sits in the fact that Europe solved yesterday S energy problem and now faces today S version of it. I have learned over a long life in business that many people prepare brilliantly for the last disaster. Then the next disaster comes through a different door. Europe spent decades learning the lesson of the 1970s. Middle Eastern crude was a vulnerability. That was the lesson. Oil producers could cut supply, prices could jump, petrol stations could run dry, governments could be forced into rationing, growth could fall, inflation could rise, so Europe adapted, it diversified, it built reserves, it developed alternative suppliers, it reduced direct exposure to Gulf crude. It learned that energy security is not a slogan. It is an insurance policy. That was the right lesson at the time, but it was not the final lesson. The problem today is more subtle. Europe may not be as dependent on Gulf crude as many Asian countries are, but it remains exposed to the products that crude becomes: diesel jet fuel, the fuels that move trucks, planes, goods, tourists, food, and people. And when the bottleneck moves from crude supply to refined product supply, the whole problem becomes harder. A barrel of crude is potential energy. Diesel is usable energy. Jet fuel is usable energy. A modern economy does not run on potential. It runs on the thing that can be put into an engine this morning. That distinction is the heart of the coming shock. People hear that the Strait of Hormuz is open and relax. They hear that Europe only imports a smaller share of crude from the Gulf and relax. They hear that reserves exist and relax. I understand the instinct. People want to believe the system has buffers, but buffers are not the same as safety. A cash reserve can protect a business from one bad quarter. It cannot fix a permanently broken business model. Oil reserves can protect an economy from a short disruption. They cannot create refining capacity that does not exist. They cannot manufacture jet fuel out of confidence. They cannot make an airline fly when the economics no longer work. That is why this oil shock will not hit Europe like a lightning strike. It will hit like water moving through walls. First, a little damp spot appears, higher prices. Then a stain spreads. Airlines warn about costs. Then paint begins to peel. Flights are cut, diesel tightens, freight gets expensive, tourism weakens. By the time the public realizes the wall is wet, the leak has been traveling for weeks. That is the danger. The Strait of Hormuz carries roughly 20 million barrels a day in a world that consumes around 100 million barrels a day. The world has found ways to reduce the shortage, reroute some flows, release reserves, and keep part of the system moving. But when the disruption is historically large, partial success still leaves a very large hole. A smaller hole is still a hole. And when the hole sits in energy, it eventually has to be filled by either new supply or lower demand. There is no third option. This is the part politicians dislike and investors sometimes forget. In the short term, you can move inventories around. You can outbid another buyer. You can release emergency reserves. You can ask consumers to remain calm. You can delay the visible pain. But if enough supply is missing for long enough, demand adjusts. Demand adjusts through price. Demand adjusts through fewer flights. Demand adjusts through closed pumps. Demand adjusts through lower industrial output. Demand adjusts through households making different choices. The adjustment always arrives. The only question is who pays for it first. Asia has already been paying Japan, South Korea, India, the Philippines, Vietnam, and countries dependent on Middle Eastern crude or refined imports feel the shock earlier because their exposure is more direct. Australia shows another version of the same lesson. It may not buy much crude directly from the Gulf, but it depends on imported refined products from countries that do. When the suppliers are squeezed, Australia is squeezed too. That is how energy shocks travel. They do not respect the neat categories people use in conversation. Direct importer, indirect importer, crude buyer, product buyer, rich country, poor country. Energy shocks move through actual dependence, not the labels governments prefer. Europe's dependence is different, but it is real. Europe is better diversified in crude than it used to be. That is the comforting part. The uncomfortable part is that Europe does not have enough refining capacity for all the diesel and jet fuel it consumes. It fills gaps through imports, including from the Gulf and from countries that themselves rely on Gulf crude. That is not a detail. That is the weak link. If crude is short, you search for crude. If jet fuel is short, you cannot simply tell passengers to wait while a new refinery is built. If diesel is short, supply chains do not politely pause until policy catches up. They become more expensive, less reliable, and more political. Diesel is not just another fuel. Diesel is logistics. It is trucks. It is shipping within the continent. It is agriculture. It is construction. It is the unseen machinery of daily life. When diesel becomes scarce or expensive, the effect flows into food prices, delivery schedules, industrial costs, and government anger. Jet fuel is not just another fuel either. In Europe, jet fuel is tied to tourism, and tourism is tied to income. Air travel contributes enormous value to Europe's economy and supports millions of jobs in Southern Europe. The connection is even more direct. Spain, Italy, Greece, and other tourism. Heavy economies depend on the movement of people during the summer. That is why this summer matters so much. A jet fuel problem in January is painful. A jet fuel problem in July is a different animal. In July, every canceled flight has a tail. The tourist does not arrive. The hotel loses revenue. The restaurant loses business. The seasonal worker loses hours. The local government loses tax receipts. The national government faces pressure to help. The airline faces higher costs and lower reliability. The customer blames someone, and politicians begin looking for someone to blame. That is how fuel becomes politics. If you want to understand energy, do not stop at the barrel. Follow the barrel until it becomes a job, a bill, a vote, or a broken promise. Europe has a refined product problem hiding behind a crude oil discussion. When a continent debates the wrong bottleneck, it wastes time. After the 1970s, strategic reserves were built because leaders understood that an oil interruption could become a national emergency. That was wise. But those reserves are limited. They buy months, not years. And if the shock continues, every barrel released today is one less barrel available for the next stage. The fire here is not only the Strait of Hormuz, the strait is the visible point. The deeper issue is the way the global energy system has optimized itself for efficiency rather than resilience. Crude moves from one place, refineries sit in another, products move somewhere else, airlines hedge based on assumptions, trucking companies price based on regular supply, tourists book based on normal availability, governments budget based on normal inflation. Then one choke point is disrupted and the system discovers how much normality was built into the plan. That is what shocks do. They reveal assumptions. Europe assumed that diversification away from Gulf crude solved the problem. It solved part of the problem. Europe assumed that reserves could bridge a disruption. They can bridge part of it. Europe assumed refined product imports would remain available. That is the assumption now being tested. And the test is arriving at a bad time. European consumers have already lived through years of high inflation and energy anxiety. Industries have already faced higher gas and power prices. Governments have already spent money cushioning households. Budgets are not fresh. Voters are not patient. Central banks are not eager to cut rates into another inflationary shock. And politicians do not have the luxury of telling citizens that the math is complicated. Citizens experience energy as price, then as scarcity, then as anger. People will ask whether the strait is open or closed. That is an important question, but not the only one. A big question is whether the energy system trusts the route enough to behave normally. This is why I would not be comforted by one or two good headlines. A shipment arrives, a reserve release is announced, a price falls for a few days. Those things matter, but they do not prove the system is healthy. In a stressed system, small improvements can happen while the larger problem continues to move downstream. The test will be whether product markets calm down. Watch diesel, watch jet fuel, watch flight cancellations, watch Southern Europe as summer demand, watch whether governments start talking less about crude and more about products. That language shift will tell you when the real bottleneck has become impossible to hide in business. A shortage of the final product is always more dangerous than a shortage of the raw material. If you are short of raw material, you may find another supplier. If you are short of the final product at the exact moment your customer needs it, the sale is gone. The revenue is gone. The relationship is damaged. For Europe, the customer is not just a person buying fuel. It is the tourist buying a flight, the supermarket waiting for delivery, the farmer needing diesel, the airline planning a route, the hotel expecting July bookings, the economy expecting motion. That is the key word. Motion. When motion becomes expensive, growth slows. When motion becomes uncertain, behavior changes. When motion is rationed, politics changes. I do not think Europe is doomed. That is lazy thinking. Europe has adapted before and will adapt again. It can buy more from the United States, Nigeria, Norway, and other suppliers. It can conserve. It can coordinate. It can accelerate energy transition. It can improve emergency planning for jet fuel. But learning usually happens after pain. The question is how much pain comes first. The old weakness was over-reliance on one region for crude oil. The new weakness is reliance on a global refining and product distribution system that has less spare capacity than people assumed. That is a different kind of vulnerability. And because it is different, many people will recognize it late. They will keep asking, why prices are high after the strait opens. They will keep asking why airlines cancel flights if crude is available somewhere. They will keep asking why Southern Europe feels more pain than the headline import number suggested. The answer will be the same every time. The crisis moved from crude to products. Once that happens, the visible story changes. It stops being a geopolitical headline and becomes an operating problem. Operating problems are often more stubborn than political ones because they cannot be solved by one statement. You cannot talk a refinery into existing. You cannot tweet a tanker across the ocean faster. You cannot negotiate with physics. Energy is physics plus logistics plus time. That combination is ruthless. The next stage of this shock will not be measured only in barrels. It will be measured in flights, removed from schedules, diesel supply warnings, higher freight costs, weaker tourism receipts, and political pressure in countries with little room for another inflationary hit. That is why I would call this a delayed European oil shock, not because Europe was hit first, because Europe may understand it last. And in markets, understanding something last is often the most expensive position of all.